Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e6. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn d7 to d5. Knight b1 to d2. Pawn c7 to c5. Knight g1 to f3. Knight b8 to d7. Pawn e4 takes d5. Pawn e6 takes d5. Queen d1 to e2, check. Knight g8 to e7. Pawn b2 to b3. Pawn b7 to b6. Queen e2 to d1. Bishop c8 to b7. Bishop c1 to b2. Pawn f7 to f5. Knight f3 to e5. Pawn c5 takes d4. Bishop b2 takes d4. Knight e7 to c6. Queen d1 to h5, check. Pawn g7 to g6. Knight e5 takes g6. Rook h8 to g8. Knight g6 to e5, check. King e8 to e7. Queen h5 to f7, check. King e7 to d6. Knight e5 takes c6. Queen d8 to e8, check. Knight d2 to e4, check. Queen e8 takes e4, check. King e1 to d1. Queen e4 to g4, check. Pawn f2 to f3. Queen g4 to g6. Knight c6 to e5. Queen g6 takes f7. Knight e5 takes f7, check. King d6 to e7. Knight f7 to e5. Bishop f8 to g7. Pawn f3 to f4. King e7 to d8. Knight e5 to f7, check. King d8 to e8. Knight f7 to d6, check. King e8 to d8. Knight d6 takes b7, check. King d8 to e8. Knight b7 to d6, check. King e8 to d8. Knight d6 takes f5. Bishop g7 to f6. Knight f5 to h6. Bishop f6 takes d4. Pawn c2 to c3. Bishop d4 takes c3. Rook a1 to c1. Rook g8 to g6. Knight h6 to f7, check. King d8 to e8. Knight f7 to g5. Bishop c3 to b2. Rook c1 to c2. Pawn h7 to h6. Rook c2 to e2, check. King e8 to d8. Knight g5 to f7, check. King d8 to c7. Rook e2 takes b2. Rook a8 to f8. Bishop f1 to d3. Rook g6 to c6. Knight f7 to e5. Rook f8 takes f4. Pawn g2 to g3. Knight d7 takes e5. Bishop d3 to b5. Rook f4 to d4, check. King d1 to e1. Rook c6 to c1, check. King e1 to e2. Rook d4 to a4, check. King e2 to d2. Rook c1 takes h1. Bishop b5 to d3. Rook h1 takes h2, check. King d2 to c1. Rook e4 to e1, checkmate.